Thank you, Sally, for agreeing to join us today with Bev Derewianka. This is a really good opportunity for us to hear about the functional approach to language and the growth and development of that over time. Can you start by telling us a little about the functional approach to language?
Yes, well, when we talk about the functional approach, we're talking about a theory or a model of language as well as the practice of teaching language and language education. So when we talk about the model, we're talking about systemic functional linguistics, or SFL for short. And this model was developed by Professor Michael Halliday, a leading figure in in linguistics more generally, modern linguistics. And one of the most exciting things for teachers about the model is that it deals with language as meaning, meaning-making resources, if you like, and within a context. And the context has a powerful influence over the choices of language that we make, and in the choices of language we make also influence the context. So we think about the context in terms of the broad overall purposes for which we communicate. At school, explaining phenomenon, for example, is a really important part of knowledge building and demonstrating knowledge. Other purposes, instructing and analysing texts, poetry, etc. These are all purposes, and achieving these purposes results in particular recognisable types of text. We call these genres, and they're shaped by the context. So apart from the context, apart from that broad purpose, we've also got the more immediate context, and we call this register. Register is, first of all, we're concerned about the topics, particularly at school, the field knowledge that is being developed. So we explain differently in history than we may in science. In history we may explain using the past tense. In science we may explain using the generalised present tense because we're explaining the natural world and how it is. So as well as the topic, we're also concerned with the audience, the tenor, the roles and relationships that people are playing in an interaction. And at school, again, as teachers, we adopt an expert role in order to explain phenomenon, and we want to support our students to adopt that expert role. But when we go into the staff room, we may adopt another role with our colleagues. We tend to be a lot more familiar and use language in very different ways. And the third variable is the mode, and that the mode is the how, if you like, that I'm speaking now, I'm using gesture, I'm using tone of voice, and, those types of things help me to create the text, not only the words that I'm using. There are many modes at play in creating text these days, but again, as students move into the middle years of schooling, we need to sort of support them in developing the written mode of dense and more abstract meanings.
Thanks, Sally, for that introduction to the model. Now let's hear from Bev.
When I was at school, grammar was taught by labelling the parts of speech in sentences such as "study lest you fail," "oh that he were here," or "Robert caught a mouse in a trap." While this gave us a rudimentary terminology for talking about language, research in the 1960s indicated that traditional school grammars did little to enhance students' literacy development. For the next few decades, grammar virtually disappeared from the curriculum. In the meantime, however, a great deal of research was being carried out into developing a model of language that's relevant for today's students. Rather than fragmenting language into individual words and learning a set of rules for correct speech, Halliday's functional approach started with the functions that language performs in our lives. He identifies three main functions. The first deals with how we use language to represent our experience of the world, allowing us to express ideas concerning the doings and the happenings, the participants in these doings and happenings, and the surrounding details, such as when, where, and how the activity is taking place. Another function of language is to enable us to interact with others, to take on different roles, to develop relationships with others, to express our emotions, opinions and judgments, and to engage with alternative viewpoints and possibilities. And finally, language functions to organise our ideas and interactions into texts: spoken texts, written texts, visual texts and multimodal texts using a range of media. We can think of each of these functions as forming a set of resources that we draw on in creating various kinds of meanings. We make choices from each of these systems of resources depending on the particular context. When composing a persuasive piece of writing, for example, students would need to draw on resources for expressing and connecting their ideas about the field or the topic in question. They would also need to draw on interpersonal resources to adopt a strong stance and to create an engaging tenor. And they would need to use certain resources to organise the argument into a coherent, well-organised text, reflecting control over the written mode. Such a model connects directly with the kinds of language that students need in order to succeed in schooling and beyond. It's an approach that sees language as a resource for making meaning and as a dynamic system of choices. The job of teachers is to make sure that all students are constantly expanding their repertoire of choices in order to meet the language demands of schooling.
We've seen how rich this model of language is. Can we now have a look at how it might work in practice?
Yes, well, in the functional approach, when we think about practice, we're talking about the ways that we support our students to learn language, to learn about language, and to learn through language. Now, Halliday was always interested in the role of language in education, and when he came to Australia in the 70s, he organised a language in education conference, and at that conference were some really powerful linguists and teachers who came together. People like Jim Martin and Gunter Kress and Frances Christie and Joan Rothery, and all of whom had a huge impact on language education. One of the really central concerns of these people was to provide equitable outcomes for students from diverse linguistic and socioeconomic backgrounds. Now, research told us that approaches that were used at this time didn't support students for learning the language of power, the language of schooling, the dense and written forms of language that aren't just picked up from home or picked up from the playground or even learned from being immersed in it. So the functional model was really relevant to teachers because it could really make clear the way to use language in different contexts.
So let's listen to Bev tell us a little bit more about the specifics of classroom practice.
Not only have there been significant changes in the way we think and talk about language in schools, there's also been a huge shift in the way we teach about language. Again, in the past, students were asked, for example, to underline the noun or verb in a series of unrelated, inauthentic sentences. They would do exercises from grammar books that bore little relationship to the language that they needed for school and their daily lives. And mostly they were bored and saw such activities as an irrelevant chore. Over the past few decades, however, researchers and teachers have been working together to develop an approach that explicitly teaches students the language they need in order to operate effectively in educational contexts. This work is drawn primarily on a Vygotskian theory of learning, where students learn through collaborative engagement in tasks, with guidance and input from more experienced others. An example of such an approach is the teaching learning cycle developed by Dr. Joan Rothery and her colleagues. Within the context of a unit of work, the teacher identifies a relevant purpose for which students will need to use language, for example, to explain how something works, to analyse a problem, to respond to a literary text or to argue for a position, and so on. Throughout the cycle, the teacher builds up the language the students need in order to develop their understanding of the field of knowledge in question. This might involve, for example, becoming familiar with key vocabulary, or developing technical understandings, or being supported in reading selected passages from a textbook, or learning how to take notes. Students also need to know how to shape their knowledge of the topic into a well-structured text. Depending on the genre, students might be guided to observe how a model text is organised into certain stages and phases to achieve its purpose. These observations can be drawn on as the teacher and students jointly construct a similar text, with the teacher taking the students' contributions and demonstrating how to organise them into a cohesive written text. During this process, the teacher will be drawing students' attention to specific language features that are relevant to the task. This might involve language resources for creating coherent texts, or developing paragraphs, or connecting ideas in more complex ways, or extending sentences to include more specific information, or addressing the needs and interests of the reader. At the same time, students will be provided with tools for investigating language in context, and will be developing a shared language for talking about language. Such classroom practices, where relevant language is taught explicitly and meaningfully in the context of authentic classroom tasks, is a far cry from the sterile practices of many traditional grammar classrooms. Teachers implementing a functional approach report that the students are engaged, are reading more confidently, are developing a greater range of vocabulary, and are writing more successfully. And above all, they are enjoying having a way of thinking and talking about language that makes sense to them. Students' ability to use language effectively depends on the teacher's understanding of how language works. And this is where PETAA has been at the forefront internationally in supporting teachers' professional learning.
So I understand that equity was central to the thinking around this time, and I believe that PETAA played a central role in this development too.
Yes. During the 1980s and the 1990s, people like Jim Martin and Joan Rothery worked really closely with the Disadvantaged Schools program to investigate how practices, could be developed from using the systemic functional linguistics. And these practices, because of the work with teachers and students in many schools, not only in Sydney but more broadly, the practices then fed back into the theory. So we went from understandings of grammar at the clause level to understandings of whole text patterns across whole text, and then to be looking at multimodal contexts and, grammar beyond the clause, if you like, the discourse semantics. So PETA's been influential throughout this whole process at feeding practice back into theory, theory back into practice.
And I think Bev's got something interesting to say about this also.
Australia is recognised as a world leader in its work on a more relevant, useful and theoretically coherent way of thinking about language in educational contexts. For some decades now, researchers and practitioners have been drawing on the insights of Halliday and his colleagues to develop a robust theory of language for the classroom, from the level of the text down to chunks of meaning in a clause. The role of PETAA has been absolutely central in making these understandings available to the profession through its publications and professional learning workshops. As far back as 1988, PETAA broke new ground with its publication of English Grammar, A Functional Approach by John Collison. Since then, it has consistently provided teachers with the latest in research and practice in the field of language education. These publications have informed syllabus development in all states of Australia and are increasingly in demand from regions such as Scandinavia, the UK, Southeast Asia, the USA and South America. Whenever I work with teachers in such areas, I'm constantly surprised at their familiarity with PETAA publications. They often express their admiration for a professional association that provides so much high-quality material for teachers, and lament the fact that they have no equivalent in their own country. For my part, and on behalf of language and literacy educators in Australia, I would like to express my appreciation for the support that PETAA has provided over the years in fostering teachers' understanding about language and its role in students' literacy development.
Would you say then, Sally, that PETAA provided something of scaffolding for the development of this classroom practice, both nationally and internationally?
Oh, yes. Yes, the challenge with such a rich model as functional linguistics is that how do we get it into the classroom? And that's where PETA's been a leader and just, taking us to places really that are really exciting, both within Australia and internationally. From the beginning, Bev Derewianka and John Collison were really coming from both two ends. Bev's famous Pink Book, How Texts Work, looked at looking at genres for learning in classrooms and looking at how teachers could work with patterns of language at that level, whereas John Collison's book on grammar functional approach was looking at the clause level and making that accessible. And since then, Bev's green books have really built teachers' understandings of the robust nature and recontextualised that around metafunctions. My colleagues Louise Droger and Susan Fates and myself have been very fortunate to work with PETAA to develop a workbook that, again, carefully scaffolds the teacher's understandings. The multimodal aspect of the semiotic regime. John Callow has been very influential in taking the work of Gunter Kress and Theo van Leeuwen into the classroom, and more recently Lorraine MacDonald with literature, and the list goes on, and I couldn't mention all the work that PETAA's brought to the classroom in that way.
So, Sally, thank you so much for yourself and Bev giving your time for this today. Covered a lot of ground, and I'm very grateful for your input.
You're welcome.